By the beginning of the 18th century, Iran still looked like an empire. The Safavid dynasty had ruled for more than 2 centuries. Its territory stretched across much of the Iranian plateau and into the Caucasus, Iraq, and Central Asia. Its capital, Isfahan, remained one of the great cities of the Islamic world. But the map concealed a growing problem. The state was becoming less capable of doing what an empire needed a state to do. The Safavid system depended heavily on provincial governors, tribal leaders, regional elites, and other intermediaries to collect taxes, maintain order, and raise troops. That arrangement could work when the central government was strong enough to command obedience. When the center weakened, the same structure became a liability. Provincial officials had greater incentives to retain revenues rather than pass them to the court. Regional rivals competed with one another. Military forces were harder to coordinate. And the authority of the Shah increasingly depended on whether local actors were willing to follow his commands. The problem was therefore not simply that Iran had a weak ruler. The deeper problem was that the state had difficulty converting its enormous territorial resources into coordinated power. A government can possess land without controlling it effectively. It can claim taxes without collecting them reliably. It can theoretically command an army without being able to assemble, equip, and direct that army when a crisis arrives. And those distinctions became increasingly important as pressure mounted on the empire's frontiers. The Safavid monarchy had inherited a political system in which military and administrative functions were distributed across different actors. That system required a strong center to keep those actors aligned. By the early 18th century, that central authority was increasingly uncertain. The consequences appeared first at the edges of the empire. Afghan revolts destabilized Kandahar and then Herat. Ottoman forces threatened from the west. Russian expansion placed additional pressure along the Caspian frontier. Each crisis required the state to mobilize troops and resources. But mobilization itself exposed the weakness. A strong military system does not begin with soldiers on a battlefield. It begins with institutions capable of identifying manpower, collecting revenue, moving supplies, enforcing orders, and coordinating commanders. The late Safavid state increasingly struggled with all of those tasks. That weakness created an opportunity. Not because Iran had suddenly become powerless, but because the political center could no longer reliably convert the resources of the empire into military action. This was the environment into which Nader emerged. He did not inherit a blank slate. He inherited a large state with military traditions, administrative institutions, provincial resources, and a powerful dynastic legacy. What was missing was the ability to coordinate those resources consistently. That distinction would define Nader's rise. He did not begin by creating an empire from nothing. He began by demonstrating that he could do something the existing political system was increasingly unable to do. Raise a force, keep it together, and make it effective. And that achievement would eventually give him something more important than a battlefield victory. It would give him an independent source of political power. Once a commander can mobilize military force more effectively than the state around him, the relationship between commander and state begins to change. The commander no longer depends entirely on the state. The state begins to depend on the commander. That was the opening through which Nader Shah would rise. Nader's rise did not begin with a throne. It began on the frontier. In northeastern Iran, far from the political center at Isfahan, military insecurity was part of everyday life. The region around Khorasan faced raids and repeated conflict involving Turkmen and Afghan groups. For men living there, military ability was not simply a path to prestige. It was a practical requirement for survival. Nader grew up inside that environment. The exact details of his early life are not equally certain in every source, but the broad pattern is clear. He came from a relatively modest background within the Afsharid tribal world and entered military service while still young. By his teenage years, he was already serving as a musketeer under the governor of Abivard. That beginning matters because it explains something the familiar conqueror narrative often misses. Nader's military power was accumulated. He did not simply wake up with an army. He learned how frontier warfare worked. He gained experience in campaigns against raiders. He developed relationships with local elites and fighters. And as his reputation grew, he attracted men who saw his successes as an opportunity to improve their own position. This was a very different route to power from inheriting a centralized bureaucracy. Nader's first political asset was therefore not a title. It was capability. He could fight. He could recruit. He could survive. And increasingly, he could organize men around himself. His early campaigns were not all successful. The transcript records several attempts to defeat Afghan forces that failed, including an engagement in which Nader was almost killed. Those failures are important because they provide a better explanation for his later success than the idea of innate genius. A commander who loses and survives has to decide what the failure means. Was the problem the troops, the weapons, the battlefield, the organization, the command structure, or the assumption behind the operation itself? Nader had repeated opportunities to learn those lessons. That does not prove that every later military innovation came directly from one specific defeat. But it does show that his military system developed through experience rather than appearing fully formed. At the same time, the collapse of Safavid authority created an unusual political environment. As central control weakened, local commanders and regional power holders had more room to act independently. Nader benefited from that fragmentation. He was not trying to rise through a stable hierarchy. He was operating in a system where the hierarchy itself was breaking apart. That gave capable commanders an opportunity to accumulate power faster than they could have under a strong central government. In Abivard, Nader gradually increased his influence. He acquired followers, punished rivals, and expanded the number of armed men willing to serve him. The transcript describes this process as a combination of selective generosity toward those who submitted and harsh treatment of those who resisted. This was more than personal charisma. It was an emerging political economy. People joined because Nader could offer rewards. They remained because he could enforce discipline. And his ability to win engagements created the expectation that future service might produce future gains. That expectation is extremely important in a military system. An army does not exist only because soldiers are ordered to fight. It exists because soldiers believe the organization can provide something worth fighting for, whether that means pay, protection, status, land, booty, political advancement, or loyalty to a commander. Nader began assembling precisely that kind of network. And the weaker the Safavid center became, the more useful his network became. The relationship between state weakness and Nader's rise was therefore reciprocal. The state lost capacity. Nader gained followers. Those followers gave him more military capacity. More military capacity gave him more independence from the state. And that independence made it possible for him to intervene in conflicts on terms increasingly favorable to himself. By the time Nader encountered the surviving Safavid prince Tahmasp, he was no longer simply a local commander. He had become a regional military actor with his own force. When Tahmasp sought allies to recover territory from rival Afghan and regional powers, Nader joined the campaign with a substantial contingent of cavalry and infantry. He arrived not as a court official waiting for an assignment, but as a commander whose armed following was itself a political resource. That distinction would shape the next phase of his career. Tahmasp had the dynastic claim. Nader had the military capability. At first, the two complemented one another. Tahmasp provided legitimacy. Nader provided force. The arrangement was useful precisely because neither side could easily achieve its objectives alone. But the balance between them was already unstable. Nader's military successes increased his independent authority. Tahmasp's court, meanwhile, remained divided over how much influence the commander should possess. At one point, Tahmasp openly moved against Nader, only to be defeated and forced back under his control. This was the moment when military capability began to convert directly into political power. Nader no longer needed the Safavid political center simply to give him orders. The Safavid dynasty increasingly needed Nader's army to recover its own territory. That reversed the normal relationship between state and commander. The next question was whether Nader could turn this independent military network into something much larger. An army of loyal followers could win local battles. An empire required a system. It needed standardized weapons. It needed training. It needed artillery. It needed supply. It needed officers who could reproduce the commander's intentions without the commander personally standing beside every unit. Most importantly, it needed a way to sustain the army after the battlefield victory ended. Nader had acquired the first ingredient. Now he had to build the machine around it. Nader now had something the collapsing Safavid state increasingly lacked. An army that could act as a coherent instrument. But recruiting more men was not enough. A larger army is not automatically a stronger army. Thousands of men can still lose if they cannot receive orders, coordinate movement, sustain fire, or hold formation under pressure. Nader's real achievement was to turn manpower into repeatable military capability. That transformation happened through organization. His armies increasingly combined musketeers, artillery, and cavalry in ways that allowed each arm to solve a different part of the battlefield problem. Infantry could deliver sustained firearms fire. Artillery could disrupt dense formations and fixed positions. Cavalry could exploit openings, protect vulnerable sectors, or deliver the decisive movement after an enemy formation had been weakened. The point was not that Nader invented every one of these weapons. He did not. The important change was how systematically he integrated them. A firearm becomes strategically useful only when the army can employ it reliably. That requires ammunition. It requires training. It requires officers who know when to fire and when to move. And it requires a command system capable of coordinating different units under pressure. Nader's battles repeatedly demonstrate this principle. At Sangam, for example, his musketeers occupied prepared positions while cavalry protected them and maneuvered around the battlefield. At Herat, he combined musketeers, artillery, and cavalry reserves while using smaller movements to draw Afghan forces into positions where his firepower could be used more effectively. These were not simply displays of individual battlefield courage. They were demonstrations of an emerging system. The system depended on discipline. In the Battle of Memondost, Nader's forces faced an opponent with a substantial numerical advantage. Nader deliberately repositioned his army, placed artillery on favorable ground, and held his men under pressure until the opposing cavalry was close enough for concentrated fire to take effect. When the Afghan assault lost momentum, Nader's infantry and artillery shifted from defense to attack. The lesson is easy to miss because the battle is usually remembered as another Nader victory. The more important point is what made the victory reproducible. His soldiers had to obey orders even when the battlefield appeared to favor immediate action. They had to hold position. They had to coordinate fire. And they had to transition from one tactical role to another when the situation changed. That is what discipline does. It allows a commander to translate a plan into collective behavior. Without it, artillery is just a collection of guns. Muskets are just weapons. Cavalry is just manpower on horseback. With it, those elements become a system. Nader also learned to use the environment around that system.
Terrain mattered.
Visibility mattered. Enemy expectations mattered. At Malayer Valley, for instance, smoke from firearms reduced visibility, and Nader used the confusion to reposition his right wing before attacking the Ottoman left. The maneuver worked because the army could make a coordinated movement while the battlefield was obscured. Again, the interesting point is not simply that Nader found a clever battlefield trick. It is that he possessed an army capable of executing one. A commander can identify an opportunity. Only an organized force can exploit it at scale. This distinction separates tactical brilliance from military capability. Nader certainly possessed tactical judgment, but his larger achievement was institutionalizing enough of that judgment into the army itself that his forces could respond quickly and consistently. That required more than battlefield leadership. It required training. The army had to drill. New recruits had to learn how to operate alongside experienced soldiers. Officers had to maintain discipline. Weapons and ammunition had to be supplied. And the central government had to make sure the army remained available for the next campaign after the current campaign ended. This is where the story begins to change again. An army that can win a battle is useful. An army that can repeatedly win campaigns becomes politically transformative. Every victory increases Nader's credibility. Every successful campaign attracts additional followers. Captured territory generates new resources. Defeated enemies can provide recruits, tribute, or access to productive regions. The military system therefore begins feeding itself. Success produces more resources. Resources produce more military capacity. More military capacity creates the ability to win more wars. That sounds like a self-sustaining cycle, but it is not free. Every additional soldier must be fed, armed, paid, moved, and supplied. Every new campaign increases logistical requirements. Every new territory creates another region that needs to be administered. And every victory can create another strategic commitment. This is the point at which Nader's military revolution becomes a state-building problem. The army is getting better. It is also getting more expensive. The difference matters. A small force can sometimes survive on local resources and occasional rewards. A large, permanently mobilized army cannot. It needs predictable revenue. It needs records. It needs taxation. It needs officials capable of transferring resources from provinces to the center. It needs an administration that can plan beyond the next battle. The military transformation therefore created a dependency. Nader could no longer maintain his strategic system through battlefield talent alone. He needed a fiscal machine behind it. This is the point where the familiar story of Nader Shah changes direction. Up to now, military reform looks like the solution to Iran's weakness. And it was. The new army allowed Nader to restore territory and defeat opponents who had previously exploited Safavid weakness. But a stronger army also changed the scale of the state itself. Iran now had to support the army that had made Iran stronger. That meant the next transformation would not happen on the battlefield. It would happen in the treasury. Because once war became the state's most effective instrument, the state increasingly had to organize itself around the requirements of war. And that is where Nader's greatest military success began creating its first hidden cost. Nader had solved one problem. Iran could fight again. But military power creates its own demands. An army that wins one campaign can survive on extraordinary measures. An army that fights continuously across multiple fronts requires something more durable. A reliable flow of money. This is where Nader's military transformation began to reshape the state itself. The logic was straightforward. More soldiers meant more wages. More artillery meant more equipment and ammunition. Long campaigns meant more food, transport, animals, and supplies. New territories meant garrisons. And victories created new enemies, new borders, and new strategic commitments. The army that had restored Iranian power was therefore becoming the largest recurring expense in the political system. Nader responded by strengthening the connection between taxation and military mobilization. He could not rely on the loose fiscal arrangements of the late Safavid period and still maintain the force he had created. Revenue had to become more predictable. Officials had to be monitored. Provincial resources had to reach the center. And the central government needed better information about what each province could actually provide. This is why Nader's state building cannot be separated from his wars. Administration was not an abstract modernization project. It was increasingly a mechanism for sustaining military power. The result was a feedback loop. A stronger army allowed Nader to conquer more territory. Conquest increased the resources available to the state. Those resources allowed Nader to sustain a larger army. The larger army created new military ambitions and commitments. Those commitments required even more revenue. And greater revenue requirements pushed the government toward stronger central control over taxation. The cycle was efficient, but efficiency did not make it painless. A state can increase its ability to extract resources faster than its population can absorb the burden. That distinction became increasingly important under Nader. The military machine had to be financed whether or not every campaign produced immediate economic benefit. And Nader's campaigns were continuous. He fought in the east against Afghan forces. He fought the Ottomans in the west. He intervened in the Caucasus. He later invaded Mughal India. Each campaign could produce strategic or financial gains. But each campaign also consumed resources before those gains arrived. War therefore created a timing problem. The state had to pay today for the possibility of gaining resources tomorrow. That required confidence that the central government could continue extracting enough revenue to keep the army operational. Nader increasingly built that confidence through direct control. Under his rule, tax collection became more systematic. Officials were monitored more closely. Accounts were demanded from provinces. The central government sought greater visibility over revenue flows and greater control over the officials responsible for collecting them. The transcript describes a network of officials, inspectors, and spies developed to monitor taxation and provincial accounts. This was a major change from the looser arrangements of the late Safavid period. The center was no longer merely requesting resources from powerful provincial actors. It was increasingly attempting to measure, supervise, and enforce extraction directly. That increased state capacity. But it also changed the political relationship between the center and the provinces. A governor who once had room to negotiate could now face direct inspection. A local elite who once retained greater control over revenue could be required to provide more of it. And peasants and townsmen ultimately carried much of the fiscal burden. The result was a stronger central state. It was also a more demanding one. Nader's military victories therefore had two opposite effects. They increased the state's power, and they increased the state's appetite. This distinction is crucial. A successful military campaign can make a government richer. But it can also convince that government that even more military capacity is possible. Once Nader had defeated one enemy, another frontier became the problem. The army that defeated the Afghans could be used against the Ottomans. The army that defeated the Ottomans could be used in India. And the wealth acquired in India could finance further expansion. The logic became self-reinforcing. Success created the resources for more success. But that also meant the state became increasingly committed to maintaining the military machine. Nader's Indian campaign demonstrates the scale of this transformation. The conquest of Delhi produced enormous tribute. Contemporary and later accounts describe vast quantities of gold, silver, jewels, elephants, and other wealth taken from the Mughal Empire. The exact value is debated, but the financial impact was substantial enough to transform Nader's short-term fiscal position. For a moment, the cycle appeared almost perfect. Military success produced extraordinary revenue. Extraordinary revenue relieved immediate fiscal pressure. Nader could even declare a temporary period of tax relief after returning from India. But that relief was temporary precisely because the underlying system had not changed. The army still existed. The empire still had to administer its territories. And Nader still had military objectives. A treasury filled by conquest can solve an immediate deficit. It does not automatically create a sustainable fiscal system. This distinction becomes especially important when we compare two kinds of state capacity. The first is mobilization capacity. Can the government extract resources quickly and direct them toward a war? Nader's government became extremely good at this. The second is resilience. Can the government maintain political cooperation, fiscal stability, and institutional legitimacy while continuing to mobilize those resources over time? That question was harder. The stronger the army became, the more the state had to maintain the fiscal machinery behind it. And the more demanding taxation became, the more important coercion became when cooperation weakened. This is where military and political logic began to interact. A government that relies heavily on voluntary cooperation can reduce the cost of administration. A government that expects compliance because it can punish resistance may extract more in the short term. But coercion has a cost of its own, can reduce trust, can encourage evasion. It can turn local elites from intermediaries into opponents. And it can force the government to spend more resources enforcing decisions it could previously implement through cooperation. Nader increasingly relied on a highly centralized model. He wanted information. He wanted compliance. He wanted predictable revenue. And above all, he wanted the resources required to keep the army operating. The result was a state that became more capable of mobilizing resources from its territory. But that very capability made the political system more dependent on the continued performance of the military machine. If the army stopped winning, revenue would become harder to obtain. If revenue weakened, the army would become harder to maintain. If the army became harder to maintain, Nader's ability to enforce central authority would weaken. The state was becoming a tightly coupled system. Military power supported fiscal extraction. Fiscal extraction supported military power. And both increasingly supported Nader's political authority. That was an extraordinary achievement, but it contained a structural vulnerability. A tightly coupled system can perform extremely well when its central components are functioning. It can also become fragile when one of those components begins to fail. Nader had created a state that could mobilize. Now he needed to make sure that state could endure. And that would prove much harder. Because building institutions that can extract resources is not the same as building institutions that can survive the disappearance of the ruler who controls them. It would be easy to tell Nader's story as though he built an army and simply used that army to rule. That would be incomplete. Nader did more than recruit soldiers and win battles. He changed the machinery of the state. That distinction matters because the central question is not whether Nader created institutions. He did. The harder question is what those institutions were designed to accomplish, how deeply they became embedded in Iranian political life, and whether they could continue functioning without the ruler who had driven their creation. Nader inherited a political system whose central authority had weakened substantially. His response was to strengthen the center. That required information. A ruler cannot tax a province effectively if he does not know what it produces. He cannot pay an army reliably if provincial revenues remain uncertain. And he cannot enforce central policy if local officials are able to conceal information or retain resources without consequence. Nader therefore pursued greater administrative visibility. Land and revenue had to become more measurable. Provincial officials had to become more accountable. The central government needed regular information about what the provinces were producing and what they were supposed to contribute. The transcript describes a system of officials, inspectors, and spies used to monitor taxation, while provinces were expected to submit regular accounts. This was a significant change. The late Safavid state had depended heavily on intermediaries whose cooperation was often necessary for taxation and military mobilization. Nader increasingly tried to reduce that dependency by increasing direct central oversight. The objective was not simply administrative tidiness. It was state capacity. Information gave the center leverage. Records made comparison possible. Inspection made evasion more difficult. And stronger central control over revenue made it easier to support the military system Nader had created. The same logic applied to the army. Nader did not want military power distributed entirely among autonomous provincial or tribal commanders. A ruler who depends on independent military elites can become their hostage. A ruler who controls a larger share of the army directly has more freedom to enforce policy. This was one of the central tensions of Nader's state building. He wanted to replace fragmented military authority with centralized command. That increased his power dramatically, but it also concentrated responsibility. The more military institutions were brought under the center, the more the center had to pay for them. The more the army depended on the central government, the more important central revenue became. And the more central revenue mattered, the more important administrative control became. This was a coherent system. It was not simply a collection of disconnected reforms. Military centralization supported fiscal centralization. Fiscal centralization supported administrative centralization. Administrative centralization supported military centralization. The system reinforced itself. Nader also attempted reforms in areas beyond taxation and military organization. The state altered monetary arrangements. Administrative records were strengthened. Efforts were made to regularize the payment of soldiers and officials. These changes reveal something important about Nader's political project. He was not merely consuming the institutions of the old Safavid order. He was trying to redesign them so that the state could mobilize resources more effectively. That makes the central problem much harder. If Nader had simply ignored institutions, his later collapse would be easy to explain. We could say that he built everything through personal force, leaving nothing behind. But that is not what the evidence suggests. He created real administrative mechanisms. He expanded central oversight. He changed fiscal practices. He strengthened the direct relationship between the state and the army. He made the government more capable of extracting resources and directing them toward strategic objectives. In other words, Nader succeeded at something extremely difficult. He increased state capacity. But capacity is not the same as resilience. A state can become more powerful at doing things without becoming better at surviving political shocks. Consider the difference. Capacity asks, can the state collect taxes? Can it raise troops? Can it move supplies? Can it enforce decisions? Can it defeat an enemy? Nader's government increasingly answered yes. Resilience asks different questions. Can elites cooperate without the ruler personally forcing them to? Can a succession crisis be managed without civil war? Can institutions restrain destructive decisions? Can the political system transfer authority from one ruler to another without losing coherence? Can the military remain loyal to the state rather than to the person who commands it? These are different forms of state strength. And the second group would become much more important near the end of Nader's life. The problem was not that Nader's reforms were meaningless. The problem was that they were built inside an exceptionally centralized political structure. The state became stronger because the center became stronger. The center became stronger because Nader controlled more of the military and fiscal system directly. And Nader controlled that system because his personal authority was extraordinarily high. This created a subtle dependency. Institutional mechanisms existed, but the political relationship connecting those mechanisms remained highly personal. A provincial official might obey because the tax system required it, but he might also obey because he feared the ruler. A military commander might serve within the central structure, but he might remain loyal primarily because Nader had made his position possible. A provincial elite might accept a new administrative arrangement because resistance was too costly. That is effective government. But it is not necessarily durable government. Durability requires institutions that continue producing obedience after the person who built them disappears. This distinction would become increasingly important as Nader expanded his power. The more successful he became, the more he had to manage the contradiction between institutionalization and personal rule. He needed institutions strong enough to administer the empire, but he also needed to prevent those institutions from becoming independent centers of power. He therefore had incentives to keep important authority close to himself. This created another feedback loop. More centralization increased administrative capacity. But more centralization also increased dependence on the center. And the more the center depended on one ruler's personal authority, the greater the consequences of any failure at the top. That is why Nader's state should not be described as either fully institutional or purely personal. It was both. It had genuine bureaucratic and fiscal mechanisms. It also had an unusually high concentration of political authority around one man. The historical question is not which description is correct. It is how those two characteristics interacted. For as long as Nader remained capable of commanding armies, supervising officials, distributing rewards, punishing disloyalty, and deciding the strategic direction of the state, the system could function with remarkable effectiveness. But every system has a hidden test. What happens when the person at its center becomes unable to perform those functions? That test was still years away. For the moment, Nader's reforms appeared to be working. Iran had a stronger military. The central government had greater fiscal reach. Provincial administration was more closely supervised. And the state could mobilize resources on a scale the late Safavid government had struggled to match. Nader had therefore accomplished something real. He had rebuilt state capacity. But by strengthening the center so dramatically, he was also making the center more important than ever. That was the unresolved contradiction. The state was becoming more capable. But the political system was not necessarily becoming more independent of the ruler who made that capability possible. And the more successful Nader became, the harder it would be to separate the strength of the state from the strength of Nader himself. The more successful Nader became, the stronger his state appeared. And yet success was quietly changing the nature of that state. Every victory expanded Nader's ability to mobilize men and money. But every victory also increased the scale of the system that had to be maintained. This is the paradox at the center of his career. Military success did not merely solve problems, created new ones. When Nader defeated the Afghan forces, he recovered territory and strengthened his political position. When he defeated the Ottomans, he restored additional territory and demonstrated that Iran had once again become a major military power. When he turned toward India, the objective was larger still. An expedition that could remove a major external threat, produce enormous wealth, and reinforce his position at the center of the Iranian state. Each success made the next campaign easier to finance. But each success also made the military system harder to stop. The army could no longer be treated as a temporary force assembled for one emergency. It had become the core instrument through which Nader governed. That created a feedback loop. Military victory produced resources. Resources supported military expansion. Military expansion increased political power. Political power enabled further centralization. And centralization made it easier to extract the resources required for the next war. This was extraordinarily effective. It was also increasingly difficult to reverse. The Indian campaign makes the mechanism especially visible. Nader's victory over the Mughal Empire brought enormous wealth into his hands. The exact value of the captured treasure is disputed, but the scale was sufficient to transform his finances temporarily. The wealth included precious metals, jewels, elephants, and other valuable goods, while the conquered territories west of the Indus were also transferred to him. For an 18th-century ruler, that was an extraordinary windfall. Nader could use it to pay the army. He could reduce immediate pressure on his taxpayers. He could reward commanders and followers. And for a short period, he could demonstrate that military expansion had produced tangible benefits for the population and the state. But the windfall did not remove the underlying dependency. The army remained. The empire remained. The frontiers remained. And Nader remained a ruler who expected to continue campaigning. A treasury filled through conquest is not the same thing as a self-sustaining fiscal state. The system still required recurring revenue. It still required officials capable of collecting it. And it still required an army large enough to preserve everything Nader had won. The contradiction therefore became sharper. The greater the empire became, the greater the number of things that had to be protected. The greater the army became, the greater the resources required to maintain it. And the more resources the government needed, the greater the pressure placed on the population and provincial elites. That pressure mattered politically. A state can extract resources through cooperation, through expectation, or through force. The first two are cheaper. The third can work very effectively in the short term, but it creates a different relationship between ruler and subject. Under Nader, taxation became increasingly demanding, while officials were subjected to closer monitoring and punishment for evasion. The transcript describes a centralized network of inspectors and spies used to supervise revenue collection and provincial accounts. That system improved the center's ability to mobilize money, but it also reduced the room available to local actors. A provincial governor who understood that failure could mean punishment had a strong incentive to comply. He also had an incentive to protect himself from the center. That could produce accurate accounts. It could also produce concealment, resentment, and competition over access to the ruler. And as the system became more centralized, Nader increasingly had to supervise those relationships himself. This is where personal authority began to matter more than simple administrative capacity. A centralized bureaucracy can function through procedures. A highly personalized bureaucracy often functions through the ruler's ability to reward and punish. Nader was exceptionally effective at both. He could be generous to those who submitted. He could be severe with those who resisted. And he could use military success to reinforce the credibility of both policies. The transcript describes this pattern early in his rise and shows how it continued throughout his career. Followers who accepted Nader could be incorporated into his growing system, while determined opponents were punished. That method had an advantage. It reduced the cost of destroying every rival. A defeated enemy could become a recruit. A former opponent could become a subordinate. A local commander who accepted Nader could preserve his position. This gave the system flexibility. But it also created another dependency. The political order increasingly depended on Nader's ability to decide who should be rewarded, who should be punished, and who could be trusted. That is a problem that becomes more serious as a state grows. When a ruler governs a small network, personal supervision may work. When the state expands across vast territory and incorporates many different elites, personal supervision becomes a bottleneck. There are only so many decisions one ruler can make. Only so many people he can trust. Only so many reports he can personally evaluate. At some point, institutions have to carry information and authority without passing every decision through the ruler. Nader's reforms moved the state toward centralization, but his style of rule also made the center unusually dependent on his personal judgment. The result was a system that was highly capable under a strong ruler. It was less clear whether that capability could survive a weak one. That distinction became increasingly important in Nader's later years. His military success had already removed many of the external threats that had helped justify his authority. The Afghan invaders had been defeated. Ottoman territories had been recovered. The Mughal Empire had been humiliated and forced to pay enormous tribute. The state was no longer simply fighting for survival. It was governing an increasingly large imperial system. That changed the political problem. A commander can justify extraordinary measures during an existential war. It is harder to justify the same measures once the immediate emergency has passed. The ruler must then answer a different question. What is the political purpose of continued extraordinary mobilization? Nader's answer remained closely connected to military power. Campaigns continued. Taxes remained important. The army remained central. And the state's institutions continued to be organized around the requirements of maintaining that strength. The result was a subtle transformation. Military power had originally been the solution to state weakness. Now military power was becoming the organizing principle of the state itself. That was Nader's greatest achievement. It was also the beginning of his greatest vulnerability. Because once the army became the foundation of the political order, the state became dependent on keeping the army loyal, paid, supplied, and victorious. And once political authority became concentrated around the man commanding that army, the problem became even more personal. A powerful army can sustain a ruler. But what sustains the system when the ruler begins to lose the ability to sustain the army? That question would become unavoidable in Nader's final years. For most of Nader's career, military success solved political problems. When territory was lost, the army could recover it. When rivals resisted, the army could defeat them. When a provincial ruler refused to cooperate, the army could enforce the center's authority. But military power and political legitimacy are not the same thing. An army can make a ruler obeyed. It cannot, by itself, explain why that ruler should be obeyed after the immediate threat has disappeared. This distinction became increasingly important as Nader moved from commander to ruler. At the beginning of his rise, Nader needed the Safavid dynasty. Tahmasp II possessed something Nader did not: dynastic legitimacy. Nader possessed something Tahmasp lacked: military power. The arrangement was therefore mutually useful. Tahmasp could claim the throne. Nader could provide the army needed to recover the territory of the Safavid state. The political system could therefore present Nader's victories as restoration rather than revolution. He was not initially trying to replace the dynasty. He was restoring it. That arrangement gave both men an advantage. But it also contained a contradiction. The more successful Nader became, the less necessary Tahmasp's military role became. And the less necessary Tahmasp became, the more difficult it was to preserve the original balance between dynastic legitimacy and military authority. The transcript captures this transition clearly. After Nader defeated Tahmasp's forces, he did not immediately destroy the Safavid dynasty. Instead, he continued using Tahmasp's authority and seal while effectively controlling military and political decisions himself. That was a rational decision. Safavid legitimacy still had political value. The dynasty had ruled Iran for generations. A large part of the population and political elite could recognize a Safavid Shah in a way they could not automatically recognize a military commander from Khorasan. Nader therefore had an incentive to borrow legitimacy before attempting to replace it. This is an important principle in state formation. Power does not always destroy existing institutions, can first operate through them. A rising actor may use an old institution because that institution provides something military force cannot immediately create. For Nader, the Safavid dynasty provided continuity. His army provided coercive power. Together, they created a temporary political coalition. But temporary coalitions are not necessarily stable political systems. Eventually, Nader had to decide whether he would remain the power behind a Safavid throne or become the sovereign himself. In 1736, he took the second path. The Afsharid monarchy was established. This was an enormous transformation. Nader was no longer merely restoring the Safavid state. He was creating a new political order. And that meant the source of legitimacy had to change. A Safavid ruler could inherit legitimacy from dynasty, history, and religious identity. Nader had to construct legitimacy around other foundations. Military success was one. Imperial restoration was another. Personal authority was a third. And each had limits. Military success is powerful because it produces visible results. A victorious army can recover cities, can defeat enemies, can expand territory. But success is not permanent. A ruler who gains legitimacy through victory must continue producing victory or find another basis for political acceptance. That created an underlying dependency in Nader's new monarchy. The army was not merely the instrument that protected the state. It was one of the main sources of the ruler's legitimacy. That made military strength politically valuable. It also made military failure politically dangerous. A ruler whose authority rests heavily on the army must keep the army satisfied. That requires pay. It requires successful campaigns. It requires rewards. And it requires a convincing explanation for why the costs of maintaining the military system are necessary. This is where Nader's military fiscal state encountered its political conversion problem. The state had become extremely good at mobilizing resources for war. But war itself could not provide an unlimited source of legitimacy. At some point, people had to live under the system that military success had created. Taxes had to be paid. Officials had to obey. Provincial elites had to cooperate. Religious communities had to accept the political order. And commanders had to believe that their future remained tied to the central state. Nader attempted to manage these problems through a mixture of reform, symbolism, reward, and coercion. But the balance was difficult. The more central authority expanded, the less room remained for independent political actors. The more the army depended on the center, the more commanders depended on Nader's favor. The more provincial elites depended on the center, the more dangerous it became to challenge it. That can produce extraordinary short-term cohesion. But it can also reduce the number of political institutions capable of mediating conflict when the center itself becomes unstable. This is the difference between obedience and legitimacy. Obedience answers, will people follow the order? Legitimacy answers, will the political system remain accepted when following the ruler becomes costly? Nader could often secure the first through military power. The second was harder. This problem became more severe after the Great Conquests. During existential struggle, extraordinary demands can be justified as necessary for survival. But once major external enemies have been defeated, extraordinary demands become harder to justify. Nader's victories had changed Iran's strategic environment. He had recovered territory. He had defeated powerful rivals. He had acquired enormous wealth from India. He had built an army feared across the region. The state was no longer fighting simply to survive. It was now trying to manage an empire created by continuous military expansion. That required a different political settlement. The population needed predictability. Elites needed a reason to cooperate. Commanders needed confidence that the political system would remain stable. And succession needed to be clear. These are the functions that a resilient state must perform after the battlefield victory. Nader's system struggled most with that transition. The very structure that made him powerful also made his personal judgment unusually important. He had become the final point of decision. Military commanders looked to him. Officials depended on him. Provincial power holders feared him. Rewards came from him. Punishments came from him. Political strategy came from him. This created a remarkable concentration of authority. It also meant that institutions had fewer opportunities to develop as autonomous sources of stability. A strong ruler can overcome institutional weakness. But the stronger the ruler becomes, the less obvious it may be that the institutions are weak. As long as Nader was alive, decisive, active, and feared, the system could continue to function. The test would come when those qualities began to disappear. And by the final years of his reign, there were signs that the relationship between ruler and political system was changing. Nader was becoming increasingly suspicious. Trust inside the political elite was deteriorating. Reports of conspiracies multiplied. Advisors who might once have challenged the ruler's decisions disappeared from the inner circle. The system became increasingly dependent on information controlled by Nader's spies and on judgments made by Nader himself. The transcript describes his final years as a period in which he had few trusted advisors left and was increasingly isolated from corrective voices within his own camp. This was more than a personality problem. It was an institutional problem. A political system needs mechanisms that can tell the ruler when his assumptions are wrong. It needs people with enough security to disagree. It needs procedures for succession. It needs elites who believe they still have a place inside the system even when the ruler changes. Without those mechanisms, centralization becomes dangerous. The state becomes dependent on the accuracy of one man's decisions. And when that man loses trusted advisors, the system loses part of its ability to correct itself. Nader had built an extraordinarily capable machine, but capability was not enough. The machine needed an integrator. And more, that integrator was Nader himself. That was the dependency hidden beneath his success. The army could survive without him for a while. The bureaucracy could continue issuing orders. The treasury could still collect revenue. But the political system that connected those components had become heavily dependent on his personal authority. And soon, that authority would be tested in the most severe way possible. Not by an Ottoman army, not by an Afghan rebellion, not by a Mughal emperor, but by the disappearance of the man at the center of the system. By the final years of Nader Shah's reign, the central problem was no longer whether Iran possessed enough military power. It had more than enough. The problem was whether the political system could remain coherent while that power was concentrated around an increasingly isolated ruler. This distinction explains why Nader's final years matter so much. His army had not suddenly become ineffective. His fiscal reforms had not simply vanished. His administrative machinery had not ceased to exist. What was deteriorating was the relationship between the institutions and the person controlling them. Nader had spent much of his career reducing uncertainty by increasing central control. Now that same centralization meant that political uncertainty at the top became more dangerous. The system had fewer independent centers capable of correcting the ruler. The court had fewer figures willing to challenge him. Military commanders had strong incentives to remain loyal, but those incentives depended increasingly on personal relationships with Nader rather than on a predictable political order. And the ruler himself had become increasingly suspicious of those around him. The transcript describes a final period in which Nader's spies repeatedly reported conspiracies, while trusted advisors disappeared from his circle. By 1747, he had reached a point where there were very few people around him capable of challenging his decisions or persuading him to reconsider them. That matters because political systems need correction mechanisms. No ruler has complete information. No commander sees every threat correctly. No tax report is automatically reliable. And no intelligence network is immune to manipulation. An effective state therefore needs institutions that can absorb mistakes without turning every mistake into a crisis. Nader's increasingly personal system struggled with that problem. The ruler's judgment became more important precisely when his access to independent advice was becoming weaker. That produced a dangerous feedback loop.
Suspicion encourage de surveillance.
Surveillance produced more reports of possible conspiracies. Those reports reinforced suspicion. Suspicion reduced trust. Reduced trust encouraged further centralization. And further centralization made the ruler even more dependent on the information reaching him personally. The system became increasingly difficult to correct from within. This is where the distinction between centralized capacity and institutional resilience becomes decisive. Centralization can make a state faster. A ruler can make decisions without negotiating with numerous competing actors. Orders can move quickly. Resources can be concentrated. Military campaigns can be launched with fewer delays. Nader had demonstrated the advantages of that model repeatedly. But centralization has a second side. When fewer actors have independent authority, fewer actors can act as a brake when the center makes a mistake. That does not make centralization inherently bad. It makes centralization dependent on the quality of the center. As long as Nader was highly effective, the advantages dominated. As his judgment became more distorted by suspicion and isolation, the same structure became more dangerous. And the problem extended beyond Nader's personality. Succession remained unresolved. Who would inherit the political system? Would the army remain loyal to the dynasty? Would provincial commanders accept the successor? Would the administrative structure continue to function if competing elites began fighting over access to power? These questions had no easy answer. Nader had created a political order whose legitimacy was heavily connected to military achievement. But military achievement could not guarantee a peaceful transfer of authority. The army could enforce a ruler. could not automatically decide which ruler should come next. That distinction would become catastrophic. By 1747, rebellion was spreading. Nader's response increasingly reflected the logic that had served him throughout his rise. Identify threats, isolate them, and use coercive force before they grow. It was a rational response from the perspective of a ruler who had built his career by surviving through action. But the environment had changed. The greatest threat was no longer an external army that could be defeated on a battlefield. It was internal fragmentation. And internal fragmentation could not be solved simply by adding more force. When opposition exists inside the elite and military structure itself, repression may remove individual opponents without eliminating the incentives that created opposition. Nader's final decisions therefore became increasingly dangerous. The transcript describes his confrontation with suspected conspirators in June 1747. He intended to eliminate members of his own camp whom he believed were disloyal, while planning to deal with a broader rebellion at the same time. The crucial detail is not the specific assassination plot. It is that Nader had reached a point where he trusted almost nobody. That tells us something about the structure he had built. A political system that depends heavily on personal loyalty eventually has to answer a difficult question. What happens when loyalty itself becomes impossible to measure? Nader tried to solve that uncertainty with more surveillance and more coercion. But those tools could not restore trust. They could only manage its absence. On June 20, 1747, Nader ordered action against members of his own circle. The plan was discovered. The men who feared they would be killed acted first. A small group of conspirators entered Nader's quarters that night. Nader resisted, but he was killed. The ruler at the center of the system was gone. And that is where the true test of Nader's state began. His death did not immediately erase every institution he had built. There were still soldiers. There were still administrators. There were still provincial structures. There was still wealth accumulated from years of conquest. But the person who had connected those components had disappeared. Now the political system had to answer a question it had been postponing for years. Could the state reproduce Nader's authority without Nader? That is a very different problem from rebuilding an army. An army can inherit weapons. A bureaucracy can inherit records. A treasury can inherit money. But legitimacy cannot simply be inherited in the same way. Commanders need to know whom they obey. Provincial elites need to know which authority is permanent. Administrators need to know which orders will survive a change of ruler. And soldiers need confidence that their pay, position, and future remain secure. If those expectations disappear, the components of the state can begin competing against one another. That is what happened after Nader's death. The political system no longer had a single figure with enough authority to command the entire military coalition. The Afghanistan state fragmented rapidly, and Iran entered another period of political instability. This does not mean that Nader had built nothing. It means something more precise. He had built a state with substantial mobilization capacity. But that capacity had not been converted into equivalent political resilience. Nader had solved the problem of how to make the state act. He had not fully solved the problem of how to make the state continue acting when the person who commanded it disappeared. That distinction is the key to understanding both his achievement and his failure. Nader was not simply a brilliant conqueror whose personality collapsed at the end. He was the central integrator of a system he had spent decades building. And because so much of that system had been organized around his authority, his disappearance was not just the loss of a ruler. It was the removal of one of the main mechanisms holding the system together. The final question, then, is not why Nader's empire collapsed after his death. It is why a state powerful enough to defeat the Ottomans, overthrow Afghan rulers, invade the Mughal Empire, and centralize enormous fiscal resources had still failed to develop enough resilience to survive the loss of its founder. The answer lies in the same mechanism that made Nader powerful in the first place. He had centralized the state to make it effective. And in doing so, he made the state increasingly dependent on the center. Nader Shah's death did not erase the state he had built. That is the first point we need to establish. The army still existed. The bureaucracy still existed. The provinces still existed. The wealth accumulated through decades of warfare had not simply vanished overnight. And yet the political order collapsed with remarkable speed. That is not proof that Nader had built nothing. It is evidence that the parts of the system capable of mobilizing power were not equally capable of reproducing political authority. That distinction changes how we should understand his legacy. Nader had solved one of Iran's most urgent problems. He had restored the ability of the central government to raise armies, collect revenue, defeat external enemies, and project power far beyond the Iranian plateau. He had also created mechanisms for supervising taxation and centralizing authority that were considerably stronger than those available to the late Safavid state. The question was whether those mechanisms could operate independently of the ruler who had created and enforced them. After Nader's assassination in 1747, the answer proved disappointing. The Safavid Empire rapidly fragmented. Nader's successors failed to reproduce the same degree of political control, and the empire entered another period of instability and competition among regional powers. Notice what happened. The military machine did not magically disappear. The problem was coordination. Different commanders had their own interests. Different elites had their own calculations. Different regions had their own power bases. Under Nader, these interests had been subordinated to a central authority powerful enough to enforce decisions across them. After Nader, that authority became contested. And once the center was contested, the incentives of every other actor changed. A commander who had previously benefited from central rule now had to ask whether remaining loyal was still the best option. A provincial official had to decide which claimant to support. An elite family had to assess whether cooperation with one faction would leave it exposed to another. The same institutions that had once transmitted commands from the center could now transmit competing commands. The state therefore faced a coordination problem. Nader had spent years reducing the number of actors who could independently challenge the center. But when the center itself became uncertain, those actors had not disappeared. They had simply been waiting for the political structure to loosen. This is one of the paradoxes of strong centralization. It can suppress fragmentation very effectively. It does not necessarily eliminate the underlying interests that produce fragmentation. A powerful ruler can keep those interests aligned. A succession crisis can release them all at once. That is why succession is not an administrative detail. It is a test of whether political authority has become institutional. If succession depends primarily on the identity of the ruler, then the death of that ruler creates a political vacuum. If succession is managed through accepted institutions, competing elites have an established mechanism for transferring authority. Nader's system never fully resolved that problem. His own authority remained the central reference point. He was the man who appointed commanders. He distributed rewards. He controlled strategic decisions. He determined which elites were trusted. And his military reputation gave the whole system credibility. Once he disappeared, the political system had to function without the person whose authority had made those relationships intelligible. That is why the speed of the collapse matters. It is not merely an unfortunate ending to Nader's biography. It is evidence about the architecture of the state. A state can be extremely centralized and extremely effective while the central ruler is alive. But if all major political relationships ultimately depend on that ruler, the state may have enormous capacity without equivalent resilience. Nader's career demonstrates both sides of that equation. He rebuilt military power. He strengthened fiscal extraction. He centralized administration. He recovered territories. He defeated major regional powers. He acquired enormous external wealth. He even created a new dynasty after the end of Safavid political dominance. Those were not illusions. They were genuine transformations. But the durability of a state depends on more than its ability to mobilize. It depends on whether political actors continue to see cooperation with the state as safer and more profitable than competing with it. Under Nader, cooperation was often reinforced by a mixture of rewards, military success, administrative control, and coercion. Once his personal authority vanished, that combination became much harder to reproduce. There was no equivalent figure with the same military reputation. No successor possessed the same combination of battlefield credibility, political authority, and control over the army. The institutional machinery therefore lost its central integrator. That is why the post-1747 collapse should not be described simply as a failure of administration. It was a failure of political reproduction. Nader's state could produce extraordinary power under Nader, could not reproduce Nader, and that is a much more interesting historical problem, because the objective of state building is not merely to create a strong ruler. It is to create a political structure that can continue producing coordinated action when rulers change. Nader's achievements show how far Iran could be pushed toward centralization in a relatively short period. His downfall shows the limit of that process when institutional resilience does not grow at the same pace as military and fiscal capacity. The result was a state that could move faster than the Safavid state had moved, could extract more, could fight more, could conquer more, but it was not equally capable of absorbing the shock of losing its founder. That is the collapse test, and Nader's state did not pass it. Not because nothing had been institutionalized, not because Nader had failed to reform the government, and not because his military achievements were somehow imaginary. It failed because the political system remained too closely tied to the person who had made its various components work together. The army was real, the administration was real, the fiscal machinery was real, but the political order connecting them was still heavily personalized. That distinction explains why an empire capable of defeating powerful foreign states could disintegrate so quickly after the death of its founder. And it brings us to the final question. What exactly had Nader built? A stronger state than the one he inherited. A more centralized state. A more militarily capable state. A state with greater fiscal reach. But not yet a state whose power was fully independent of the man who had created it. That is the paradox at the center of Nader Shah's career. Nader Shah's greatest achievement was not that he conquered more territory than his predecessors. It was that he restored Iran's ability to act as a centralized military state. He built an army capable of repeated campaigns. He expanded the fiscal machinery required to sustain it. He strengthened central administration. And he turned a fragmented political order into a state capable of defeating powerful external enemies. But those achievements created a final contradiction. Nader increased capacity faster than he increased resilience. The state became better at mobilizing soldiers, collecting revenue, and enforcing decisions. It became less dependent on fragmented provincial power. But political authority remained heavily concentrated around the ruler who connected those systems. When Nader disappeared, the institutions did not disappear with him. What disappeared was the authority that made them cooperate. That is why his empire could become extraordinarily powerful and still collapse so quickly after his death. Nader did not fail to build a state. He built a state whose military and fiscal strength outpaced its ability to reproduce political authority. And that is the paradox of his legacy. He rebuilt Iran into a powerful war-making state, but never fully solved the problem of making that state survive its founder.